Good morning, everyone. It's a blessing to be together as a group. It's a long time since we've been together because of sickness and travel and such. And there's just something about not being together as a collective body that, wow, I feel like I struggled, even though some of us gathered in smaller groups. It's just not the same. Last time I spoke, um, I was intending to share this message, but God took me on a journey to. I had to learn some things first. I've been exploring the thought of offensive Christianity, and I know maybe a term we could use would be radical Christianity. I like the shock factor maybe of the word offensive. Thinking of it in a military sense, and with intrigue, with this sermon in mind, I've been watching the military operations of Russia the last few weeks as they've been on offensive missions, which have actually been defensive. They've been covering their tracks and protecting themselves. And for sake of argument, an offensive mission is one where we are gaining ground. We're taking action and we're pushing back against the enemy. Being in sports, we talk about offensive, defensive. In military, we use the same terms. And I'm using that same thought in our Christian life. Last time, for those of you who weren't there, and for refresher memories, we looked back at the life of the people of God as they were coming out of captivity, and as they were rebuilding. They come back to Jerusalem as they're building the city, and as they're building the temple there. And we took lessons from Ezekiel and Ezekiel as he was rallying the troops, as they were working through things, as they were pushing back against their own countrymen, the opposition that they faced. And we tried to understand the steps that it takes for us to become offensive in our Christianity. And there was huge acts of bravery as God's people reestablished and rebuilt the altars, places of worship. We saw the heart-wrenching revival as the people of God came back, and as they were beginning to do this rebuilding, and then they realized that they had taken wives from the pagans, something that God had said you cannot do. And as they went through that process of freeing themselves from the sin that they had taken on, maybe unknowingly. And as we also saw, as they were building, they had not only tools of building, but they had tools to protect themselves. They were carrying their weapons as well. As this fight that was happening, I think I maybe tabled the thought of comparing offensive Christianity to spontaneous combustion. As a fire, is a pile of organic matter begins to build heat at its core, and as that heat grows, and it comes to a point where it erupts into flames. I just think of experience back in 93, 94, 95, in there somewhere, where we had a barn fire at our place. As a young man, as a youth, I remember our barn, our cattle barn at that time, we had rented out to a local trucker, and he was collecting Holstein cattle, and collecting them there, and then they reload them onto trucks, and they'd take them down to Philadelphia. I believe it was during Desert Storm, and they were feeding the Holsteins, where these old cow cows were being used to feed the troops in Kuwait. But I remember going to the barn. There's a load of cattle came in. We didn't have to do chores, but as a young fellow, I wanted to talk to the trucker and all that sort of stuff, watch these cattle be unloaded. There was a pile of hay in the back of the barn that, unknown to us, moisture had come underneath the back doors of the barn and had put moisture inside this stack of hay. I forget, it was 8 or 9 o'clock at night. We were up in the barn. We went back, and then a few hours later, we got the phone call, or someone stopped in to say, hey, the barn's on fire. What happened, even though we were in the barn not long before, we didn't smell smoke. There was nothing there. The conditions weren't quite right for the fire to start, even though heat was building all of that time. But as that heat continued to grow, it erupted into a fire that we needed fire trucks for. And that is the movement that I believe happens inside the body of Christ. As we as individuals get a picture of who Jesus is and continue to follow and obey him, there's something that happens inside us as individuals that spreads to our brothers, to our sisters, to the community around us. And that is the thought that I want to explore today. And as this passion for radical obedience to the teachings of Jesus Christ increase and pour out of us as individuals, it starts an inferno that is powerful, that cannot be quenched. There's no water, there's no powers of darkness that can stop that. I also want to remind us that Ephesians 6:12 says, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. The last few weeks, I've again been reminded of the spiritual warfare that happens even inside. I talked a little bit on Wednesday night of the forces I felt like I was dealing with as a parent. Not that our families are in the clutches of Satan, but I feel that God can create tension inside our homes as we push back against. The more we push back against darkness, the more Satan is going to try and unsettle us and bring things in to trip us up and to take our attention away from what really matters. As I've watched Christendom today, I believe Christendom as a whole, I'm not pointing fingers at any group of people, but Christendom as a whole has watered down the teachings of Jesus. You think of, and I've looked at my own life as I've been studying Matthew and trying to teach through Matthew with some people, what Jesus teaches about how to deal with money, how Jesus teaches about conflict resolution, our love for our fellow men, what to do with our enemies, evangelism, these core teachings of Jesus Christ, and we've watered them down and diluted them so thin. And I think I believe as we teach and study and put into practice these radical teachings, it starts something within us. Offensive Christianity is not motivated by me, by us as a corporation, but it's only a result of when we faithfully follow what Jesus wants us to do. It's not something that we start out on Monday morning and say, hey, I'm going to do this, but rather on a molecular level, it's the result of what happens when we follow Jesus Christ. I'd like to spend our time this morning in Joshua 14. And you can turn there. We're going to try and take majority of our thoughts from this passage this morning. Joshua is an interesting book. And in Joshua 14, we get just a short snippet of a very a passage of scripture that I love reading. Joshua, it starts out as Moses has died, and Joshua has taken over the leadership of the children of Israel. There's been many battles. The Israelites have crossed the Jordan. Joshua prepares men for battle. They conquer Jericho. We read of Achan's sin and the defeat at Ai. We read about the Gideonites deceiving Israel. In Joshua 10, we read about the southern kingdoms creating an alliance, and they were defeated. Joshua's focus, there's someone at the door. Joshua's focus was destroying the enemies of God, and that was their purpose. They had to rid the land of the wicked armies. And then we get to, Joshua 13:1. It says, now Joshua was old, advanced in years, and the Lord said to him, you are old, advanced in years, and there remains very much land yet to be possessed. So then they divided the land, and that's where we get to in Joshua 14. We're going to start reading at verse 6, and then read out to the end of the chapter. How are you? So Joshua 14, verse 6. Then the children of Judah came to Joshua in Gilgal, and Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite said to him, you know the word which the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, concerning you and me in Kadesh Barnea. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me to Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought word back to him as it was in my heart. Nevertheless, my brethren who went up with me made the heart of the people melt, but I wholly followed the Lord my God. So Moses swore on that day, saying, surely the land where your foot has trodden shall be your inheritance and your children's forever, because you have wholly followed the Lord my God. And now, behold, the Lord has kept me alive, and he said, These 45 years, ever since the Lord spoke this word to Moses while Israel wandered in the wilderness, and now here I am this day, 85 years old. And yet I am as strong this day as the day that Moses sent me, just as my strength was then. So now is my strength for war, both for going out and for coming in. Now therefore, give me this mountain of which the Lord spoke in that day. For you heard in that day how the Anakim were there, and that the cities were great and fortified. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall be able to drive them out, as the Lord said. And Joshua blessed him, and gave Hebron to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, as an inheritance. Hebron therefore became the inheritance of Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, to this day, because he wholly followed the Lord God of Israel. And the name of Hebron formerly was Kirjath Arba. Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim. Then the land had rest from war. So we've gone through this catalog of different wars and things that have happened. We come to this account, and I'm intrigued by what happens here. I think we can learn a lot from the life of Caleb and who he was, even though we don't read a lot about Caleb. So picture with me Joshua as an old man. He's 80, 90 years old. Caleb's an old man, and Joshua has been doling out the inheritance. He's delegating portions of land, and as they get the portion of land, they're also instructed to cleanse the land of the enemy that's there. And then Caleb shows up. He marches up. He has a delegation of men with him. He marches up to Moses' tent, knocks on the door, rattles the flap, whatever it is. But he walks up and gets his... And I see these two old men as they meet, and I'm not sure how much dialogue they've had the last number of years, but they have this dialogue of what happened 40 years ago. And Caleb reminds Joshua what's happened. And he reminds him of that event when God, through Moses, chose them and the other spies to go out and to spy out the land. Reminds him of how they walked back and forth in the promised land, and saw the potential there. They saw the same thing as the other 10 spies saw. They saw the huge harvest of grapes or figs or whatever it was. Numbers 13:23 says, "Then they came to the valley of Eshcol, and they cut down a branch with one cluster of grapes. They carried it between two of them on a pole. They also brought some of the pomegranates and figs." I don't know how much of this is exaggerated, but let your imagination run. This was a prosperous land. We know that this land was flowing with milk and honey. They saw the potential, the monetary potential of taking over this land. And I'm sure Caleb and Moses talked about the giants they saw. That was a big thing that they saw. But I picture this conversation between Joshua and Caleb. Caleb reminded Joshua of the 10 spies and how the report came back, the untrue report. I am convinced that the giants they saw there were scary. I'm convinced, from what we'll look at a little bit later, I'm convinced that maybe it was not exaggerated, but the problem was that the 10 spies did not have faith, and that's where the problem lied. I believe Caleb, in his message to Joshua that day, reminded him how these 12 men were chosen to be leaders, and how they were the only two that stayed faithful to their calling. The other 10 shirked the responsibility. In fact, they led the people away from God. And we see that Numbers 13:30 says, "Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, 'Let us go up at once and take possession, for we are all well able to overcome it.'" These Joshua and Caleb tried their best to rally the troops to outvoice the false report, but they could not. Just to reiterate, in verses 6 to 10, they looked at the prosperous land. They reminded the people, they reminded themselves that God has led us to this place, and God will carry us through. God is faithful. verse 9, do not rebel against the Lord and do not be afraid of the people of the land. I can see this conversation happening. And Caleb reminds Joshua that remember that God, because I was faithful, God promised. Yahweh promised me the land of Hebron. And now I'm here today. God has kept me healthy. God has kept me alive. I have as much strength today as I did 45 years ago. I'm here to claim my inheritance. And that inheritance is what I want to explore. This act of Caleb coming back and exploring. Caleb knew it was in the mountain. Caleb knew what was ahead of him. But he said, Yahweh promised it to me. Yahweh instructed me to have that for my inheritance, and I'm here to claim it. He says, give me my inheritance, and if Yahweh wills, I will drive out the enemy as Yahweh has commanded. Who is Caleb? We don't know much about Caleb. Numbers 13:6 tells us he was from the tribe of Jephunneh. That doesn't tell us a whole lot. We don't know a whole lot about his family. His family hardly even comes on the radar of the Bible story. But we do know that he was a man of renown. I quoted Numbers 13:30. He was a man who was able to quiet the people. He was a man who had reputation, a good reputation. Sirach says, in the time of Moses also he did a work of mercy, he and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, in that they withstood the congregation and withheld the people from sin and appeased the wicked murmuring. He was a man that was respected. He was a man who, when he spoke, people listened. This is who Caleb was. Numbers 14:29-30 reminds us he was favored by God. I'll read it. The carcasses of you who have complained against me shall fall in this wilderness, all of you who were numbered, according to your entire number, from 20 years and above, except for Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. You shall by no means enter the land which I swore I would make you to dwell in it. So Caleb's life was spared because of obedience. He was a man who God honored because of his obedience. And God blessed him. And God blessed the children of Israel through him. He was a man of strength. Here he was at 85 years old. And he was ready to take on an army of giants. Joshua 14:11, we read it, I'll read it again. As yet I'm as strong this day as on the day that Moses sent me. Just as my strength was, so now is it now. Both for going out and for coming in. Here is a man who was fit, he was healthy. I alluded to it, but he was a motivator. But in verse 6, I see not just Caleb coming to Joshua's tent, but he brought a delegation with him. Maybe there's nothing to that, but I believe with what Caleb knew, he was in a position. He was a man who people listened to. He could have persuaded his fellow men to say, you know what, the stakes are too high, the giants are too big, we're not taking that. And he could have come to Joshua and said, look, I know what's up. I know what's in Hebron. I know who lives there. Give me the low country. I want something else. I'll go drive out the little nations, not the giants. He could have done that, but he had persuaded his fellow men that this was important, and he will take on the giants. Who are the Anakim? We don't know much about the Anakim, but as we read through scriptures, they come on to the radar numerous times. And agree with me or disagree with me, but just give me a few minutes, and maybe I can sway you who I think they were. So Numbers 13:30-33. I'm going to read in the ESV. Says, but Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it. Then the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land when they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. Then they saw the Nephilim, the son of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, so we seemed to them. Again, we don't know. We do know that as we read through some Old Testament scripts, there is some exaggeration, some embellishment that happens. But if you follow the thought of the Nephilim, and I think some of us have talked about this before, there is a mysterious group of people that I believe happened because of of sexual union that happened between fallen angels and daughters of women here on earth, and it produced a group of people that is dark. There's something about them that I believe. Um, Try and look up who the Nephilim were, and you don't find much. We have to imagine. But I believe we don't find much because they have been driven out and because of who they represent. There was something satanic about this. There's a Hellenistic legend that I found intriguing, and I'll just read it for what it's worth. This is not scripture, but this is a legend that I think does feed into, maybe helps feed our imagination who these people were. It says that then the daughter of Anak had gone into her father's garden and taken a pomegranate, which she ate, after having peeled off the skin and cast it aside. Then the 12 spies came, seeing her father, were struck with fear and hid themselves under the pomegranate skin, believing it to be a cave. The daughter of Anak, in the meantime, came back, seeing the pomegranate skin lying there, was afraid lest her father might scold her for lack of neatness. She therefore took the pomegranate skin with the 12 spies hidden therein and cast it out in the garden, noticing the weight added by the men no more with the skin having the shell of an egg. But I do think there's enough evidence for me to believe that there was this group of people, whoever they were, represented the powers of darkness, and Caleb knew that. There was. We looked at Numbers 13:33. They talk about the giants. Goliath was probably from this group of people. Whoever these people were they a half-breed of satanic demons and half-humans? I'll leave that as it were. But whatever they were, whoever they were pagans. They represented the world of darkness, and they had to be driven out. And Caleb knew that. They were against God. Deuteronomy 7, verses 1 to 3 does not name this tribe of people, but this is what God was telling the people of Israel. When the Lord your God brings you into the land which you go to possess, and has cast out many nations before you, the Hittites, and the Girgashites, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you, and when the Lord your God delivers them over to you, you shall conquer them, and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them, nor shall you make marriages with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons. This nation represented evil, and they had to go. Their presence and their influence was going to draw the children of Israel away from God, and they had to be destroyed. What's significant about Hebron? Why Hebron? I don't know, and this is just my rambling thoughts. But I do think there's something about Hebron that is significant. Genesis 13:18, we find an interesting story. Genesis 23. In Genesis 13, we see it first time where Abram has built his tent. His place is built an altar there. He placed his tent and built an altar. But Genesis 23 records an interesting story of Sarah had died, and he was looking for a place to bury his wife. And he goes to the Hittites and asked for a parcel of land. He says, "I'm just traveling through. I'm a stranger here. I need a small parcel of land to bury my wife." And the Hittites say, "Hey, you're of good reputation. Choose the nicest plot of land you want. It's your pick. It's yours as a gift." And Abraham says, "Look, no, I'm not looking for a freebie. I want to buy it. You say the price, and I'll buy it." And Ephron says, he's a negotiator that he's dealing with. He says, "It's worth $2,500. But like, we're friends. Like, seriously, just take it." And Abraham says, like, "No, I insist." And he shoves the money in his hand. He says, I'll buy it. I'm going to go bury my dead there." And after this time, it seems like Hebron becomes a sort of a central place in the Old Testament narrative. We see things coming back. They sort of trickle back to Hebron. I don't know if there's significance to that, but I do feel that there's something. It was like God's land. There's something significant about that. And to think about in this story that we're talking about today, now we have satanic alliances settled and taking over that land. And why does Caleb want to take this personally? I don't know. We can only surmise what's happening in Caleb's head. We do know that it was promised to him 45 years previous. But I do think as Caleb had scouted out this land, as he came back, his heart was broken because his fellow men had turned the people of Israel away from God and said, we can't take this. And as God was punishing them for that, there was something that was broken inside of him because of it. And he determined in his heart, 45 years previous to this happening, that he was going to it. Someday he was going to drive out those people. He saw that thing that had turned the hearts away, the hearts of his fellow men away from God. And he was determined to go drive that out. We do know that Caleb had a deep faith in God, and he knew that God was faithful. He knew that God would be able to destroy the evil there. I think the more important thing is Caleb, as the senior, saw the spiritual battle that was going to happen if that enemy stayed there. And as the senior, as the person who had power because of age, it was up to him to drive out the enemy. It was up to him to get rid of this dark force. And it was up to him to cleanse the land for the upcoming generation. How can we make all this practical? Last message, I painted a picture of offensive Christianity as abortion clinics being shut down, of jihadists being turned into church planters, and these big things that happened. And I'm not going to contradict that, but I have found it intriguing that picture, as I've continued to study, that picture has changed. I believe that happens, and I believe that will continue to happen, and I believe that should be our goal, that those big things, whatever it is, picture in your mind, those big spiritual battles, they will happen, and they will happen through the people that are sold out, the Calebs, as it were. But as I said before, on a molecular level, as us as individuals, as us as small groups, it might not be those big things, but they add into those big things. So how can we practice this today? How can we make this practical? I'm just going to throw out a few ideas and let your minds wander. One is the way we do community. We talk a lot about accountability. We talk a lot about knowing each other's hearts and speaking in each other's hearts. We were talking yesterday, but I was reminded of this just the first of the week. I was talking to a local pastor about one of his parishioners. And he said, his comment was, yes, he's a member in good standing, but he's doesn't really respect authority, and he's kind of a bench warmer. And as conversation who went on, alluded to the fact that he hadn't really talked to him for quite a while. And is that the level? Is that the bar we're setting for accountability? Or am I going to watch? Am I going to stand by and watch my brother or sister live a mediocre life? Or am I going to, as Hebrews 10:24 says, let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works? Or let's motivate, provoke, I think is another word we can use. Are we going to provoke those in our community to be on fire for God? Verse 25 talks about, let's not neglect meeting together. Let's not neglect this, building each other up, encourage each other. In community, intentional conversation. We can sit together and talk about what we do and talk about the weather and talk about what's happening, but that's not where we gain our strength. When we sit together, let's dig deep into each other's hearts. Let's know. Let's put our finger on the pulse of each other's heart, and let's encourage. And let's, as we see our fellow man struggle or whatever it is, we know what's happening, and we speak into that, and we encourage them on. I think a big thing is submission. Submitting one to another. Ephesians 5:21. We submit one to another. We put ourselves under each other. It's a race to the bottom. It's service to each other. A beautiful picture, but only through that we find strength. family life. You know, I am still working in the middle of this, and I have not perfected this. But do we have the hearts of our children? Are we providing a safe place for our children to grow and flourish in their life, in their characters, they're building character ready to serve God? Do we love our children enough to say no, to guide them through those difficult things? It's so easy to say yes, and yes, you can do this, but do we love them enough to say no? Are we building Ebenezer's? I find it so beautiful. Through the Old Testament story, how God many times instructed the leaders to build an altar. So one of the points was to worship at that time, but the bigger point was when they came around in their journey and they saw that altar, it gave the next generation an opportunity to say, why is this here? Why do we do this? Are we building Ebenezer's in our communities, in our homes? Are we doing things to give our children chances to say, why are we doing this? Practically looking as well at discipleship and evangelism. Over the years, as I've watched young men and women who've fallen between the cracks of well, inside the church even, who've just disappeared, they didn't have the right last name or didn't do the right things, and they fell away. Who is there to reach across the chasm, to build a bridge to them, to speak into their heart, whatever is going on? That takes hard work. But are we doing that? Are we discipling? Are we working inside of our own communities to those who are wavering in their faith? Are we willing to take a risk and to speak in their lives and to make a difference, to bring them to Christ? And thinking outside of our community as we build relationships with those who don't know Christ, it takes a lot of energy. And it's often a thankless job. And sometimes it's little results, but we don't know the little seeds that we're planting, how far reaching they will go. Be sensitive to people's needs. As tragedy strikes or whatever it is, be very quick and sensitive to that and speak in their lives at that time and be ready to meet them in their need. As we live a life of service to those in our community, that gives us an opportunity to speak Christ in their lives. Propagating faith through a transparent life. As we live our lives, as we do our work, as we go out into our communities, just doing life, living a transparent life. When we're sold to Christ, people see that and it attracts them to Christ. We don't go out to evangelize. We live a life that speaks Christ. That is the way to do it. Am I confident enough in my life to echo the words of Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ? I believe that is the level of submission to Christ that we have. In conclusion, as I said in the opening, that offensive Christianity is not motivated by me or by us as a corporation, but it's motivated by a complete obedience to Jesus Christ. His teachings are radical. His teachings sometimes are outside of what we feel is reasonable, but as we obey him, radically obey him, that is when our radical life, offensive life of service to him. Let's purpose in our hearts to submit to the complete teachings of Jesus and live a life in obedience to him. And when we do that, he will do a amazing work beyond our imagination. And with God's help, we can do that. Eldon, could you do this in prayer, please?
Yes.